Okay, welcome back. In the introduction part we took a brief look at our explosion and how it was put together. You'll have noticed that it's actually done in different slices, if you like, so all of the smoke, the heat and whatnot are on different layers, which gives us an incredible degree of control in the post-production process. Also, the explosion itself is quite sculpted, so I'm going to be showing you some ways on how to manipulate your fluids. But first I just want to dive into the very basics of setting up a fluid container and the emitters that are going to go in to make up our blast. So I'm going to just pop open the hot box and create a 3D container. Just make sure this is all reset, and I'm going to hit apply and close. Now this has created for us the 3D container. However, this grid is in centimeters at the moment, so this is a pretty small container with a lot of dynamics in Maya. You want to work at a scale, but not necessarily a realistic one. If I've got an explosion here that shoots, say, 40 meters into the air, if I was to try and do that within Maya itself, by increasing the size of this 40 meters upwards, the simulation would take so long to complete that we'd be here until next Christmas. So what I want to do is just make this bigger, but sort of keeping it within the bounds of what's possible on a normal machine. So I'm going to go for 100, 100, 100. And this is a pretty decent amount of space for a large blast, because the blast is going to happen pretty much within the confines of this container. Fluid won't actually be able to escape the confines of this box. So before I do anything else, I just want to translate this in Y plus 50, just to get it back along the floor plane. Okay, so now we've got the container. Nothing will happen if we hit play, and I just increase my frame range here a little bit. By default you'll open it up, it'll be on 24 or 25, and you want to also make sure that your playback speed is set to play every frame free. If it's set to real time, you're going to have problems simulating. So just make sure that you've got some frames to work with and that your timeline slider is on the correct playback speed. So now we've got our fluid container. It doesn't actually do anything, as I said before. This is because the fluid container will contain the fluid, but we still need a way to get the fluid into it. So I'll just hit 6 on my keyboard for shaded view, and I'll just put in a quick floor plane. This just makes it a little easier to see the fluid later on. Okay, so a couple of ways to get fluid into a container. We'll deal with the simplest first. So I'll just go to select the container, select fluid effects, and come here, add edit contents emitter, and I'll pop open the options box to make sure it's on its default, and I'll just call this test. Okay, by default you create an omnidirectional emitter. You can also create one that emits from a volume, so a sphere, a cube, same as any other sort of volume type you can do in Maya. So I'm just going to go for an omnidirectional emitter this time. I'm going to hit apply and close, and you can see here this has created this little emitter dot for us. Okay, and if I play, that will release fluid. Now, of course, if I pop open the fluid in the outliner, you'll see our test 1 emitter. We move that down to the bottom, and there we go. What we got here is pretty low res emitter emitted from an omnidirectional fluid. And just to show you that this will not work if I move it outside the confines of the container. Okay, so everything that happens is going to happen within the boundaries of this fluid box. So a couple of other things you should be aware of when it comes to emitters, and this will be the same whether you're emitting from a standard Maya emitter or you're emitting from, let's say, a piece of geometry. There's a couple of things that are used to control this. First one, basic type omni. Now, if you were dealing with geometry, you could obviously have a surface emitter to emit from the surface of the geo, or in our case we could go for a volume emitter, and you'll see this has become square. I can now resize it, and this will emit from this square. Okay, so this is all pretty simple stuff. Then you comes to your fluid attributes. Now this is what your emitter will actually be emitting. It's adding density, which is generally the smoke, it's adding heat, it's adding fuel, and it's fluid drop off, which is how much drop off we get towards the edges of the fluid. So that's basically it, really. Everything you emit into a fluid container is comprised of density, heat and fuel. We'll cover more in depth of this when we get to our actual explosion proper, but just for demonstration purposes, if I had a density of 50, you'll see that we emit a lot more density or smoke into the container. And if I had 0, you'll be seeing this, because you can't actually see the heat and fuel at the moment, which will fix that later on. So that's one way to get fluid into a container. Another way, if I just remove the emitter and leave the container, is simply use a piece of geometry, which is what I tend to do. So if I go for, say, a sphere here, there we go, and select my fluid, control select my sphere, open the hotbox up again, fluid effects, add edit contents, emit from object. Okay, so this time by default it's a surface emitter, apply and close, and there you go. So now I'm emitting from the surface of a piece of geometry, and this is quite a nice way to emit fluids, because it allows you to do, you know, the shapes you want. For instance, I could do this, and there we go. I've got this long line of fluid. The reason why you're seeing this at such a terrible resolution is simply because our fluid container has such a small resolution. These squares on the floor are showing you the voxels within the fluid. The more of these there are, the better your look's going to be. Also, the slower your simulation. And it's not just that. If I bump this up to, say, 30 and simulate these 200 frames, you'll see it takes a little longer. Okay, if I take a quick render now, and I'll just do this for comparative purposes, so let's just kidnap this one. Now the fluid's got to here in the fluid container. If I put this resolution back to 10 and hit play and render, you'll see the fluid actually changes shape quite a bit, not just in resolution, but it doesn't get as high. More goes down than goes up. So changing the resolution of a fluid container is not always as simple as designing a blast that you like and then coming in and adding more resolution to make it look better. Adding more resolution will also change how the fluid behaves. So this might seem like it's just sort of like adding resolution to a render, say from 720 to 1080, but it's not. It will actually change the overall simulation. So it is definitely something to keep in mind when you're working, and hopefully I'll have shown you by the end of this tutorial some ways to really control what's happening with your fluid, so regardless of resolution you'll be able to come back in and tweak it back to the effect that you liked. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of this emitter, and we're going to start now by just building the base emitter for the actual explosion itself. Now what I want to do is actually animate this particular emitter. I want it to start big and then shrink down very rapidly. This will give us a lot of density added towards the outside, shrinking in rapidly, so when it expands upwards we get a more sort of concussive blast effect. And this explosion will be the main explosion that goes upwards. So I can whip open one here, and if I just come from here, let's say, this will be this main explosion here. Okay, we'll then later go and add the explosion across the ground, and this one is different to the one I showed you guys in the introduction, simply because this was an explosion I've been designing for something else, but this is what we're achieving right now. So slightly sideways if you like, and upwards. Okay, so without any further ado, I've just set the resolution on 30, so our simulation will be a bit slower but not so slow that we can't do some tests. Okay, and I'm going to start off by just creating an emitter. So I'm going to actually start with a sphere, which I will then almost completely flatten. Right, and as I said, I want to animate this, so I want to make sure that it's in the bottom of the container. If a little bit is chopped off, that's fine, because I actually just want the top side to emit. So let's just get that like so, and scale it up to, let's say, here. Just go into the channel box and key all the translates. So key selected. I want to come out to frame number 5, and I'm going to set this lower. I'll go in for a 100 frame animation, so I'm going to set it to 110 frames just to give myself a little bit of overhead. And at frame 5 I want that to be a bit smaller, so let's say at frame 5 it'll be this big. So key selected, and you'll see we've got this rapidly diminishing emitter. So let's now select sphere 1, control select the fluid, and fluid effects, add edit contents, emit from object. Let's pop up the option box, and this is fine for now. Let's just apply and close, hit play, and see what happens. So you can see that this has left us with a little bit of density around the outside, but a lot of density in the middle, and that will just keep emitting and emitting and emitting, which we don't want. So let's check out under sphere 1. You'll see emitter 1. Let's go in here. This is fine. Let's add some more density. So let's try a starting density of maybe 15. Okay, and depending on how much smoke you want with your explosion, you can obviously tweak that, but I'm going to go out to about frame 6 or 7 here, 7 maybe, and I'm going to set a key for 15, and then I'm going to set this down to 0. So set key. So what this will do is just emit density for the first 8 frames. Okay, not looking much like an explosion yet, but I promise you it will do quite shortly. What we also want to do is key the heat and fuel as well. So I'm going to just key this at 1, I'm going to key the fuel at 1, I'm going to come out to frame 8 and key these both off as well. So take a look in the graph editor now. I've got the density, heat and fuel all keyed in. Just press F to focus on that, and I don't really want this gradual build up, I'd rather have a sharp effect, so just 1, 2, yoinks. That's just I just push F there on the keyboard, by the way, to get it into focus. And there we go. This just gives me flat tangents, so I don't have a sort of slope, I just straight down. So let's just check that out. There we go. That's sort of what I'm looking for. Now the reason this is so slow is because you know, we want this to act as it's a larger scale than it actually is. So we're going to add some wind and, you know, other stuff to start moving this fluid around. But the first thing we want to do is go in to the container and check out under dynamic simulation. Okay, high detail solve. I want to change to all grids. Substeps I'm going to actually key, because at the start of the explosion there's going to be a lot happening. There's going to be a lot of density, a lot of heat and a lot of fuel emitted within these sort of first 10 frames. So in order for me to help Maya out, I'm going to give it more substeps, which means it will do more calculations per frame at the start. So let's take this maybe up to frame 20, 25-ish, and let's see. Key these substeps to 3, set key, and around frame 20 I'm going to key them again to 3, and then around frame 110 I'm going to key them to, say, actually, yeah, I don't need to go all the way up to 110, so substeps 3 for the first 20 frames, and then by 25 I want to put these substeps to 1. So if we take a look at that in the graph editor, just pop that open, substeps, F to focus. Okay. Yeah, something has gone wrong there. Okay, so that's frame 1, 3, frame 20, 3, frame 25, 1. There we go. Oh, it's best to check that out in the graph editor sometimes, just to make sure everything is okay. 1, and again I'm going to set these to a linear tangent. So this will do more calculations over the first 25 frames than it will over the rest of the animation. This just helps us a bit to, you know, get this initial blast with more quality. Okay, and now we want to key the simulation scale rate. If I show you what this does, this will basically make this sort of 10 times bigger, so you can see that's now much more sort of what you'd expect an explosion to do. So this is one way we can get our explosion to look bigger than the container it's in. It sort of fools Maya and saves us a lot of simulation time. So the simulation scale rate at frame 1, I'm going to make that about 8. So I'm just going to set a key. Frame, let's see, frame sort of 13, 14. I'm going to set this around 1.5. And then let's take that all the way down to 1 by the last frame. What I'm trying to do with this is sort of, dissipate some energy. So, you know, it'll be a large explosion at the front, but as it goes through it will dissipate downwards slightly. Okay, obviously didn't set that key. Okay, so this should give us sort of a large start, and it should then slow down gradually over time. We'll be adding other effects to this to get it to slow down, of course. And that looks like a lot of density being added by our emitter, so let's just check that out, make sure it's not adding too much. No, it seems fine. Okay, so that's really the basics of this biggest first sort of large emitter onto the floor. We want to key a little bit of damp as well, maybe, so let's go back into the fluid shape, and you want to find the damp, which is just under dynamic simulation. And damp is a very, very sensitive number. If I put something like 1 in, you'll see this whole thing just stops dead almost. So I mean, when you're using damp, you want a number of sort of 0.002. You know, really, really small numbers do quite a lot. See, even this, you'll see the difference between this 1 decimal point. That's slowing down quite a bit. So what I like to do is key a damp towards the end of the animation. So you don't want any for the initial animation. You want that to be sort of as energetic as possible. And we come to the end. I might key a very slight damp of, say, 0.3. It's the same as with the simulation scale rate. We're just helping our animation to lose intensity by the end of the blast. We want this blast, big great swirls of smoke and flame that slows down over time. So that little bit of damp will help out with that. Okay, another thing we'll need to do is, obviously we'll need to shade all this, but first things first, I don't want my explosion visible on these first frames when it's sort of building up. I want it to become visible all in one sort of hit, so around here. So what I'm going to do is go to the shading tab of the fluid container, and I'm going to set a key on this transparency. Now I'm going to open the graph editor. Okay, and you can see here's my RGB transparency. My key is at frame 6, and the transparency should be keyed to 1, which is fully transparent. So let's set a keyframe at frame 7 of, say, 0.25. Okay, so let's set a key and let's see what we've got. So this goes 0.25, 0.25, 0.25. What we actually want is frame 6 is 0.25, frame 7 is 0.25. Excuse me, I think I've got something wrong here. Frame 6 should be 1. Yeah, so now this fluid should just turn on at frame 6. Boom, there we go. This is going to help us fool the eye into just seeing this go bang. Okay, so no gradual build up. And you can also, of course, then go ahead and hide this emitter. Okay, when we come back we'll talk about some basic shading and also getting this container to resize on the fly. We'll continue to tweak our emitter, you know, to get a much nicer result than the one we've got now. But that's the basics for our explosion. Comes in, bang, appears, shoots upwards. So when we come back we'll look into more settings. I thank you for watching and I'll see you in a second. Okay, welcome back. In the last part we left off here with our fluid basically going bang on and then going upwards slowly. So let's start to do some simple shading and tweaking of our contents details. So if you look under your emitter, and I'm just closing pretty much all of these down, we look under our emitter, you'll see we're adding this density, heat, fuel. If we look under the fluid container, you'll see a section called Contents Details. This deals with the settings for density, temperature, fuel. So let's take a look at the density scale. 0.5 will be enough. But the problem I'm having is that this just hugs the ground for too long. So we can kind of get that by tweaking the buoyancy. So let's just set it, say, around 20. And you'll see this now poofs up very quickly, much more explosive like. Okay, but I don't want that to do that for the entire animation, so I want this to go bang and then I want it to slowly settle down. So let's say that I'll key the buoyancy at 20, and by frame 10 let's see here. No, let's go sort of, where does our frame 7? Let's set a key again. By frame 10 let's have the buoyancy down to 10, and then when we come to the end of the animation we want this. Let's just see what we have here. Okay, before I go ahead and set any more of these, what I also want to do is just have this container dynamically resize. So I think it was Maya version 2011 that got this feature. You'll see auto resize. So when I auto resize, I don't want to resize the subsets, I don't want to resize the emitter, and I don't want to resize closed boundaries, which means I have to go up and set my boundary X, Y and Z under common properties. So this one's quite simple, boundary none, and negative Y. Negative Y, I don't want fluid to ever be able to go down under the floor plane. It would be a waste of time simulating it. Now let's try this. Okay, there we go, and as you can see, our box now resizes. Alright, our resize threshold is too high. This is the sensitivity at which it will auto resize, and our auto resize margin, as fluid goes towards this will denote how clipped it gets, if you like. So I'm going to set mine to 8. Okay, now we've got a sort of mushroom cloud effect happening here, which is kind of nice, and we can go back to dealing with our contents details section and density. So we keyed this buoyancy. Let me just bring up the graph editor. Okay, and let's take a look at buoyancy, and that's still pretty buoyant. After frame 10 it goes down, so I want to make a few other tweaks and then we'll see if that maybe needs a little bit of working out. But the buoyancy, as you've seen, just basically denotes how buoyant this fluid is, how fast it will fly up. Now it stays on the screen too long down here, so I'm going to set a dissipation of about 1. You'll see it will dissipate much faster. Okay, so that's we're just dialing these in with rough approximate values. We'll come back when we've done them all and tweak the ones that need extra tweaking. So I'm going to give this a diffusion of 0 is fine. A density pressure, I want to pressure the explosion together a bit after say the first 10 frames or so. So I'm going to set a dissipation key, set a pressure key of 0 on frame 1, and then on frame 10 I'll set it to, let's try frame 20 maybe, and let's just give that a density pressure of 10 and set a key, and we'll just see what that looks like. So that's given us a different effect, one I'm not altogether happy with. So let's try setting that a bit lower. That's on frame 20. I believe we set that to 10. Let's set it to 6. And I'm going to give a density pressure threshold of 0. Okay, so that still needs quite a bit of tweaking. Let's give it a gradient force as well. And there is a tutorial on the site that deals with all of these things in depth. It's called Fluids, starting with Maya Fluids. I don't want to cover everything in great detail here. Just want to dial these in roughly so we can come back to them. And we'll use some velocity swirl here. So I'm going to set a key of 15 for velocity swirl. And again, what I want to do is when the explosion first comes in, I want a lot of sort of swirl and movement in the beginning, and then I want that to die off as this comes in. So let's move us up to frame 40, set a key, and then at the end I want to set a swirl of 0. So that will lose energy over time, and the swirl will change how this looks. Okay, so I'm not at all happy with that density pressure as of yet, but we'll sort that out in a second. I want to add some turbulence here. I want to add a very good amount of turbulence as well. So I'm going to set the turbulence strength of 50. So I'm going to set a key on that. Whoops. Actually, I'm just going to undo my turbulence key. I want that on frame 1. So let's get this to frame, say 40 again. Set a key, go to the end and set this at 1. Set key again, a lot of turbulence at the start, dying off as the explosion comes in. Okay, that's looking better. So temperature, and we need to go up and just make sure under our emitter we know we're emitting heat and temperature. So let's go to the fluid shape and contents method. Temperature is off, so we need this to dynamic grid, and we need fuel to dynamic grid. By default these come in off, so now we turn them on. Okay, you won't see the change because we haven't actually shaded the fluid yet. So under temperature, let's give a temperature scale of say 5 to start off with. A buoyancy of 3 is fine, pressure 0, dissipation 0.1, let's see, diffusion 0.1, turbulence, let's give quite a high amount. We'll give, we'll have to see what this looks like. Dissipation, I want a lot of temperature dissipation. Let's see, and fuel can stay as it is, so let's just do some shading so we can start to see what's happening. So come here, our transparency we've already keyed, our drop off shape I'm going to turn off. This is how the fluid drops off in the container, which if I just grab a few frames. So if I'd set this to say sphere, you'll see that it drops off towards the edges of the container in a sphere like. Don't need it for this, so I'm going to turn it off. The colour, I'm just going to add a swatch here. I'll make this one sort of quite a dark grey, and this one a black. And the colour input I'm going to swap to density. And I'm really not liking that density pressure much, so I'm just going to pop open the graph editor, take a look at density pressure, and I'm just going to get rid of the key on it for now. I'm just going to put the density pressure back to 0. Okay, there we go, and I'll continue with the shading. I'll eventually come back and tweak this, but right now I just want to get a very rough base in so I can see what I'm dealing with. Okay, so this is fine. Color method set on density. Input bias I'm going to turn down a little bit until I find something I'm happy with, and we get a better look at what it's doing if I use a lighter grey. There we go. This is fine, set to temperature. Just bias it up a little bit. This opacity scale will need some tweaking. This is how opaque your fluid is and where. Okay, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. You can sort of come in, now you know where it is, and tweak it more to your liking. I'm just roughing out all the details here. The lighting I'm going to change. I'm going to turn on self shadow. As you'll see, this makes a huge difference. I'm also going to turn off real lights. Now real lights is great, they'll use a real light in your scene, but it's expensive when it comes to render time. I don't really need it so much for this, so I'm just going to flip it off. Shadow opacity, well, let's try making this a bit higher, 1.5. Oh, I kind of like it higher still, 2 maybe. Shadow diffusion, 0 is fine. Light brightness, we don't want a bright light in there, so 0.1. light color white, ambient brightness, let's see, not so much. 0.1, ambient diffusion, this is fine. Ambient color, let's pick a nice sort of orangey color. So let's go saturation of 1. Color of say 35, 36 maybe. And a V of 4. There we go. Okay, let's just see what we've got here. Okay, that's starting to look a little better. At least we can sort of tell what's going on now. This is fine where it is, so is this, so is this. Obviously if I push this up here, you'll see more temperature. We're going to need to come back and tweak all these. What we're trying to do for now is just get the basic shape sort of roughed out. Okay, let's just check the light and tabs. So yes, yes, yeah, 0.1 will be fine. Diffusion 2, color is a nice orange, so that will be fine. And I'm just going to turn on texture incandescence, and we'll come and play with this in a little while. I'll probably put that onto space time. Okay, and I can also now play around with the input bias on the density, so less, more. And again, this will be highly dependent on what type of explosion you're looking to create. Okay, just want to check that I've got everything that needs to be on. Okay, the auto resize is set fine. The dynamic simulation looks fine. Display, let's turn the voxel quality to better, and let's turn the boundary draw to bounded box. This just gets rid of the voxel display on the bottom of the grid. Okay, shaded method as render is fine. Okay, so that's the basic container set up. We're now going to come and tweak it so it starts to look a lot better. I'll just do a quick play blast to leave you with so we can see how far we'll get in the next part. So thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will just pause now and you can have a look at this play blast in just a second. Okay, so I've let that play blast out just 40 frames, and as you can see we go from nothing on the ground to an explosion in fairly short order. Now our shading needs a lot of work, as does our fluid container, and in the next part we're going to get this looking pretty decent compared to what it does now. But what I wanted to demonstrate here was just a few simple settings, mainly under the contents details and the dynamic simulation that we set in the first part, for just some of the settings that we used for, let's have a look here, for our density, for instance, to increase the buoyancy, and for our velocity to get some swirl in there and to get some turbulence in there. Now we'll start to actually craft our explosion to get it to look better, to get a fireball at the very start, and to also start to sculpt this fluid a little bit more upwards and a little bit more outwards. So I'll leave you with a play blast. Nothing special at the moment, but we're definitely getting there, so I hope to see you in the next part. Thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back. Let's dive straight in and do some shading on our incandescents, and also start to shape this fluid out to something a little more as we want it. So for a start, the reason we're getting the fluid shape we are is because of the high buoyancy at the start. Sort of pushes the fluid up. I do want to force it together a little bit as it goes up. So that's where this pressure comes in, which last time I had set way too high at 6, and this gradient force is also way too high. So I'm just going to turn that down. I'm now going to have a look at our pressure. So really I don't want much pressure at the start, because we want things quite chaotic at the very start. Obviously this being an explosion, you want that sort of chaos right at the beginning, but then as it goes up I want it to get less chaotic and lose energy, which is why we used a little bit of damp. And we've also, if we look under the dynamic simulation, we've also keyed this damp, as I said, and this simulation scale rate. This is all so we get a big blast at the start, but also, you know, it loses energy over time. So let's take a look at this pressure, and let's key the pressure, say from frame 10 at 0, so frame 25, let's set this just to a pressure of 0.5. And depending on the type of blast you're trying to create and exactly how you want it to look, you're going to have to experiment a little bit with that. Okay, that works better for me. That's sort of a more mushroom cloud effect going on there, which is kind of just what I was looking for this pressure to do. So everything else seems to be fine. Our turbulence, maybe it's a little turbulent at the beginning, so if we pop open the graph editor, let's just take a look at that turbulence. So turbulence strength, instead of starting at 50 at frame 1, I'll probably take it and just yank it down so it starts frame 1 at, say, a value of 5. This will give us less turbulence just as it comes in and quickly build. So let's take a look at that. And again, there are no really hard and fast numbers for this. It depends on the size of explosion you want to create, the exact look that you're going for. Okay, and the other thing I notice is this is a very straight up explosion, so I'm going to teach you how to sculpt this fluid more to the sides by adding extra emitters. I'm also going to show you some air fields, some volume axis fields and things of that nature. But right now I want to address the lack of shading on the incandescence. So if we just play this to a frame that's nice and hot, say frame, there we go, and we come down and we take a look at our shading. Now I'm going to bump this one up here a little bit, and what I really want to concentrate on is this incandescence, because this will be the shade of our sort of fireball. So if I push this to get us a bigger swatch, I'm just going to drag this one up here. So what I like to do is use swatches with sort of very high values to them, and I'll show you what I mean. I'll just make this one white, because this will be the hottest end of our explosion, so white hot realistically. And then I want to take this one and just give it a nice orangey colour. It's already got quite a nice orangey colour. Just going to make it slightly more towards the yellow, so like so. A bit saturation of 1, and I'm actually going to give it a value of 4. Now this has gone very yellow, but if we could zoom in here, you can see that it's also got a lot of shades in between. So I'm going to take this one now and just again set a hue into the yellow, so around here, and a V of say 0.3.5. Okay, and the last one I'm going to take down all the way, maybe to sort of much redder, so somewhere around here, and a value of 4. So you can see this has given us a nice gradient between the black and the orange here. And then I can ramp up the input bias. So we're going to need a value that looks about right there. Now I can come in, this is right at the start of the explosion, so we kind of expect it to still be a fireball at this stage, and I can take a quick render. Okay, that's looking a little too yellow. I can sort that out later, but for right now I want to dial this in so we can tell the difference between the fireball and the smoke. And if I look under the texturing and just check the lighting, so the lights look fine, Let's just go for the texturing, and I think I'm going to increase the frequency ratio, which will make this fire look a little less all the same. It's easier to show you than it is to explain. Okay, that's actually not a good shot for the texture. You can see the edges change slightly, but the fireball is still too intensely yellow, so I come up here and just dial it back a notch, just so we can see this texture. Okay, this is a better shot to show you what that texture frequency does. So here it is at 3. If I kidnap this and turn it down to 1, you should see what I mean, and I'll just do a section. Okay, so the frequency ratio gives you a much more textured look. I'm going to put mine to 3. It was previously at 2, and that should be about where I want it. Yeah, so this is fine for now for our testing purposes. This is going to change quite a lot when we up the fluid resolution, so don't get too hung up on it just now. What we want now is the main sort of shape and feel of the explosion. We can come back and tweak things like the texture and maybe the lighting a little bit later, and obviously you can do a lot with the opacity and the color of the smoke at the end. Now, what I like to do before we go any further is just take a quick play blast of this, just so I can show you guys what we've got now with the incandescence being a bit more shaded, and also with this gradient force being turned down and a little bit of pressure being added. So I think I might tweak also the diffusion. I might put a diffusion of 0.1, let's say, just so I can see what that looks like, and everything else looks about fine. So I'll just do the play blast and be back in a second. Okay, so here's sort of a 50 frame play blast of what we have so far, and it's looking pretty good. Obviously the explosion along the ground is not happening in the way I'd like it to, so we're going to address that now. But also, as this goes up, it starts to lose a lot of energy, so I'd like to add in some wind or air, just so as it goes up it gently blows sort of away as you'd expect it to. So with your fluid container selected, you want to go to Fields, which you can get here on the hotbox, or if you set the menu up here to Dynamics, whoops, making sure your field is selected, you'll see Fields up here. So I'm going to add an air field, and I'm just going to reset the settings on this. So I'll call this main explosion air, create that. Now these does matter where it's positioned, so I'm just going to pull it up, place it somewhere around the middle of the container, like so, and I want a magnitude that's quite high, so you know, because this is going to be a very big container by the time the explosion has happened. So let's get a magnitude somewhere up in sort of 200 range. Okay, and an attenuation that's quite low, so 0.01. Speed and everything else can stay the same, and let's just see what that gives us. And you should see this start to affect this fire quicker than that, actually. So let's find out why it didn't. Let's see. Max distance is fine, and we don't need to use a volume access. Direction. Okay, so it is probably working, but it's blowing it upwards. So I'm just going to go with the direction in X for now. And let's just take another quick go of this. and you can see that that's being blown sort of way out there in X. So if I just stop that, you can see that our air field is acting on our fluid. It's acting a bit much, and I think as opposed to just turning down the magnitude, I'm going to key it instead. So at frame 1 I'm going to have a magnitude of 0, and by the end of the animation I'll have a magnitude of 200. So that will just allow our smoke to sort of drift off in the wind, as you would probably perceive naturally. I've looked at many videos of explosions, some of which you saw in the introduction, and the smoke has a tendency to sort of drift off in the wind after it's lost the energy from the actual animation. And this wind field or air field will also give us some extra push as the animation gets to around frame 70 or 80, so the fluid will never completely lose momentum, which will be much better for us. So I won't play blast this out right now, because I'll do a play blast before I finish this section. But I wanted to talk about another way of controlling the direction of this fluid, because if we look at it, it sort of happens on the ground and it blasts straight up, which is kind of okay, but I'd like to see some lateral movement, some horizontal movement as well as some vertical movement. There's a few ways to do this. I'll show you a couple. For right now we'll use a nice simple one. I could use a volume axis field, but I'm actually going to use another emitter. And that sounds a bit strange because I don't actually want to emit anything into the container, but I can use the speed property of the emitter to influence the fluid that's already in there. So let's go down to Fluids and Effects, Add Edit Contents, and let's just plump an emitter in here. Now by default that will be set to Omni. I'm going to just reset its settings. I'm just going to call this Volume, and I'm going to call this Main Explosion Ground Left. You can obviously give it any name you want, and apply and close. As you can see, this has created here quite a tiny volume emitter compared to the size of our container. So I'm just going to open up the emitter itself, which will now be parked under the fluid node, and you'll see density add, pretty similar to the emitter that we use on our polysphere, except we've keyed ours, of course. So this one is also going to add smoke, heat and fuel, none of which we want. So just go in and turn them all to no emission. Everything else can stay at default. I want to go down to the volume emitter attributes and make this a sphere, and I'm also going to make it a bit bigger, so somewhere around here. Let's just see how big that is. 18 should do it. There we go. So it's quite a hefty fella. I'm going to plump this on the floor. So -50 puts it right on the floor. I might lift it up a little bit. There we go. And now this is not going to do a lot because it's not adding any heat, fuel or smoke, any density. So we'll go back to the attribute editor, and this is what we want: emission speed. So we're not going to add any, we're going to replace, we're going to add. So we're going to add some speed to this along axis 1, and you'll see now this has an arrow that points straight up, which I don't want to add the speed along the top, I want to add it along the side. So I'm going to need to rotate this. Okay, like so. Just check the channel box, and let's put that to a perfect 90. So now I've got this, which will push out in the direction of this arrow. When I go back to its attribute editor, I'm going to have a directional speed of 150, and you can see I've now got two arrows because this one's up in X and it needs to be up in Y because we rotated this. Now we've just got the one arrow there. So everything else is going to be fine. You've got a long axis 1, which means it will push in this direction. A speed method of replace should be fine. and I will now show you what this does for us. Okay, so I'll just do a quick play blast so you can see what an effect our wind field and our secondary emitter has had, and how this has sculpted our fluid in sort of a radically different way than we started with. We'll then come back in the next part and look at adding more emitters to get a better shape as we go up, and also to create a sort of fireball that goes along as well as up. So let me just play blast this for you guys now. Okay, welcome back, and here is our play blast. I just did a quick one just to show you that we now have upwards movement and also sideways movement. So when we come back, we'll look at really sort of defining the shape of this even more. Okay, thanks for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you in a minute. Hi, welcome back. In the last part we looked at using this emitter to simply push a fluid around inside the container as opposed to adding more fluid to it. So we're going to continue with this, and as I said before, this directional speed is really high at the moment just to exaggerate the effect for you guys. So I'm going to turn this down to a more manageable 5, and I'm going to start to key in some values to get more of a sculpted fluid. So I'm going to inherit velocity. This will just mean this will inherit some of the speed from the fluid already in motion, and really I'm just going to tweak this. So I'm going to put some keyframes on this long axis, and I'll show you why. If I pop open the first few frames, with a long axis of 1, this fluid will simply kind of go along this axis, but because the speed is so low, it doesn't really get a pronounced effect. If I were to turn this long axis up to, say, some higher value like 15, you'll see a much more pronounced effect. Okay, so you can already see that it's blown past the end of the container. So I'm going to set a keyframe on this long axis just so it blows it out a bit, but not, you know, at such a high value all the time. So I'm just going to set a long axis of 1 on frame 1, and I want it higher for about 10 frames. So say from frame, now maybe we'll start at frame 12, yeah, and I'm going to set this to 15, set a key. I'm going to go for about 10 frames, so around 22. I'm going to set another key, and then around 30 I want this to be back to normal, so I'll set it to 1. Okay, so we can have a look at that. I might also add a little bit of turbulence, so let's try with the speed of 1, and the frequency and turbulence speed should be fine. Let's try with the turbulence of 1, sorry, and I'm not going to use any detail turbulence. Let's just take a look at what we've got now. Okay, that's definitely expanding out nicely in this direction. And that's kind of perfect. So what I want is to get it to go in the other direction too. I want it some over here and some over here, and there is some easy ways of doing this. Of course, I can just duplicate this. So if I just hit Control D, move it around a bit, and sort of push it here, you'll see not what you expect, I imagine, because this probably won't do anything, and I'll tell you why in a second. Okay, as you can see, this one has worked and it's pushing fluid this way, this one has not. And if we open up the dynamic relationships editor, so if I go under relationship editors, dynamic relationships, you'll see that our fluid 1 here, if I go under emitters, doesn't have this emitter connected to it. So when I duplicated it, it didn't actually duplicate the connection to the emitter. So check your if something like this happens to you, check your dynamic relationship editor. You'll see here any colliders, any fields, any emitters. So now when I go back and do this, you should see that it happens on both sides at once. Okay, it does, but I'm not really liking the push I'm getting from this side, so let's just check out what can be happening here. Okay, our long axes, and it does appear that our keys didn't get duplicated, so let's just you can duplicate special and preserve this, but for right now I'll just whack it in again because it's not very complicated. So we want this to increase this long axis speed, so what I'll do is just window graph editor. Okay, and I've got no keys set for this at all, so along axis, let's just key this at frame 1. Or we can come up and disable the evaluation on our fluid container so we can start jumping around a bit. Okay, and let's say we want this along axis by number 10. Let's go frame 12 again. In fact, let's go frame 14. Let's have it slightly different. So let's make this 15, and let's set a key for that, and then we'll go over to say 22, set it again, and by 35 we want that back to 1. Okay, and I believe that's the only key I actually had set for that. A little bit of turbulence is still set. Let's just to make that slightly different. Whoops. And obviously you'll need to re-enable the evaluation on your fluid container. Okay, and let's take a look to make sure both sides are now working as we would like. Okay, so that's a quick, really easy way to start pushing fluid around without having to rely solely on air or other fields. You can actually use the emitters themselves to start sculpting the fluid out. Now I've got these two here. What I'd also like is another two to sort of push the fluid up a bit quicker, and also I can then use another emitter to add maybe a little bit more fuel and heat up the top so we get another fireball blossoming up here. But before I do that, I'll just set a quick play blast to this whole thing so we can take a look that it's sort of progressing in the direction we want it to be. So let's come here, and I'll take a play blast, and I'll see you in a second. Okay, so here's the quick play blast I did, and I kind of like the side effect that we've got. It's making our explosion look on a slightly grander scale than it was before, but I'm not getting the energy or the extra fire that I want at the top here, so we're going to use some other emitters to sort of push some more smoke and heat upwards. Now I will show you how to also move fluids around with other techniques like volume axis fields and whatnot, but for right now in this particular part we're just going to stick with the emitters. So I'm going to just connect another emitter to this, so just fluid effects, add edit contents, emitter, let's bring it up, make sure it's volume. Okay, and I know I'm gonna want a sphere, so apply and close, and I'm gonna want it a little bigger than that. And this one I'm going to animate, and I think you'll see why after I've done it. Let's get it to a reasonable size. And again, just experience and experimentation that's going to take you through this. So let's go down and let's set a speed method of replace again. Let's just set an along axis of 1 just for now, and a directional speed in Y and no X. Okay, so that should get us moving straight up. And to be honest, I want to exaggerate this effect, so I'll just set it at 15 and run a quick, just sort of take on its animation. So I'll just keyframe its translates, and by frame, let's say 50, I'm going to want, whoops, wrong one, hang on, let me just select it under here, this sort of up here, and maybe point it a little in this direction, and maybe a little higher than that. So we may have to play around with this a bit. Okay, and see what that does for us. You can see it starting to move, and it should just give the upward momentum. There we go. Okay, now you've got more of, well, massively more of a sort of upward blast. But this is spitting too much heat and fuel and fire out now. Now we're a little too much. So let's go back. And I just wanted to leave it at this big exaggerated effect so you can actually see that that really does help with sculpting this explosion look. Now, let's set this to something a little more sensible, like 1. So let's give it, by the time it's here, let's make that sort of 25. Whoops. Then we'll need to go back, key that to 1, and let's set it, say, by frame 50 at 1. Set key. Inherit velocity, yes, we want to do that. And that seems to be about fine, but it was adding too much heat and fuel, so we don't really want to add any density. Let's just try adding a little heat and fuel. So for heat, you don't really need that much. Let's try 0.15, and I'm going to key that frame 10. Let's say key that at 0.15 still, and let's turn that heat off by frame 15. Okay, let's do the same thing here for fuel. Let's add 0.5 of fuel. This will help us get a bigger fireball. Set key, set around 15, set it again, and then off by 25. Okay, so let's take a look at what that's done for us. And this again should make a more upwards blast, but not quite as radical as we saw last time. Okay, and let me see why we're getting such a big blast to the left. And one of the easiest ways to do this is, you can of course look through all of your settings and make sure they're correct, which obviously I would encourage you to do. But an easy way to see what's affecting what is once again with the dynamic relationships editor. So let's go to dynamic relationships. Let's take a look at the emitters that are connected to our fluid. I'm just going to connect number 3. See what that does on its own. Okay, so that definitely is the upward force we were looking for. I'm just going to take the fields and I'm going to disconnect the air field, so we bring that out of the equation. Okay, so I'm kind of liking that. I just like to go back and sort of selectively take out emitters so I can be sure that everything is doing the job that we intended it to do. This emitter should now not be connected, so you won't get any fire coming this way. Okay, and this way we can just sort of dial in what needs turning up, what might need turning down, for instance. And this is with all three in. Now before I do this, I just want to put another emitter in here. So I'm going to duplicate this one. So I'll just use Control D, and then I'm going to move it slightly here. I'm going to put it facing this way, and once again I'm going to key it. It's animation, it's translate, key selected, but this one I want to continue to go up somewhere around here. This is just going to add a little energy and movement in throughout all of the frames. So again, this is something you can dial back, or depending on the look that you want. So I'm going to key some along axes here. I'm going to set a key of 1 here, and around frame 25 I'll set the key. Around frame 75 I'll set a key of 0. Replace inherent velocity, yes, and directional speed we'll say, let's see, where are we? So set a key of 1 at 25, 26. Whoops. Excuse me, my container has started to play up. Let's just check the graph editor so I can set what keys I've set that. Directional speed. Okay, that's fine. So directional speed, we want this to go up. So really we want a directional speed of 1 right at the start to push it upwards. So let's set a key with that. And we want to take that directional speed away by frame 25. Okay, and I think there's something hinky there happening with my keys. So, oh no, they're fine. Frame 1 is 1, frame 25 is 0. Okay, so that's kind of set in 4 emitters to sort of blast my smoke around a bit, just very roughly. But let's take another quick play blast and see how that's done for sculpting our fluid. Okay, as I set the play blast off, I noticed that we'd keyframed the values of our fluid attributes, so we weren't adding much heat and much fuel for very long. And on this second one I forgot to set the keyframes for that, so I'm actually gonna add nothing with this second one. I'm simply going to use it to push the fluid upwards. So these two are used to push the fluid to the side. This one will simply be used to add a bit of heat and fire when it gets to the top of the explosion, so we keep some sort of dynamic fireball going, and this one will be used to push the whole thing in a more upward direction. And I've also just noticed that when I select the fluid container, you can see that all of these are purple except for this one, which means it's not connected to the fluid container. So again, dynamic relationships. And fluid 1, there we go, it wasn't connected, so I'll just hook that up. Again, that's what happens when you copy and paste from one emitter to another. A lot of the times they don't actually come in connected together. So all I've really done is just nuked all the emission from this, so we're adding no more density, no more heat, no more fuel. We're just simply using this as a pusher to give the fluid a bit of a kick. So once again, I shall play blast and see you in a second. Okay, so I'll play blasted this out now with these 4 emitters in, helping us to sculpt our fluid in the shape we want it. So I'm not entirely happy with this. These emitters pushing the fluid up are a little bit slow, so I'll probably rekey the animation on these. I may move these a little further apart, but in general, I'm quite happy with the overall shape. This dissipation is a little too high, so it's disappear in around frame 60 instead of around frame 80 where I want it to dissipate fully. So I'm going to come back and we're going to finish to tweak this explosion, and then when we've done that we're going to create a different explosion to represent the blast along the ground, because what we've got here is the main explosion from sort of the primary explosive, and then all the dust and dirt and debris on the ground is also going to get kicked out in a 360-degree radius. So when we come back we'll finish looking at tweaking our main blast, then we'll start to put in our secondary blast effects and really get down into the nitty-gritty of then how to split this into its component parts for later compositing. So I hope you've followed along with this part okay, and I will see you in a second. Thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back. In the last part I said we were going to continue to sculpt our fluid here, and the bits I weren't happy with was quite simply this emitter here and here. These are not really adding the effects that I would like. I mean, if you can see here we're stopped on frame 20 and all of our fire is dissipating at around the same time. I would like this to continue rolling up a fireball as this sort of degenerates into smoke. So we can do that pretty much with the setup we've got here. We just need to tweak emitter 3 and 4 a little bit so they're adding more heat as they go up, and maybe this one needs to go up a little faster. So first of all let's take a look at number 3, and if I scroll down you can see here I'm adding some heat and still adding some fuel. So let's pop open the graph editor. Okay, and our heat emission, push F, goes on until frame 11. It sort of dies off at frame 15. I'm going to put these as linear tangents, and our fuel emission continues until frame 25, so let's put those as linear tangents too. I also notice that it's not really pushing the fluid upwards as much as I'd like, so in order to do that I could add more speed. I could also just use some more inherited velocity. So if I disable the evaluation on my fluid container, simply so we can jump around on the timeline. Okay, I'm going to pop back to frame 0, select my emitter, go down to its inherited velocity and key that at frame 1 at a value of 3. And I want that to lose velocity over time, so I'm going to go to, oh excuse me, some big foghorn outside my window. I'm going to go to frame 15, key it again at 3, and then go to frame 25, key it at 1. This will give us just a little bit more upward momentum in this. Now if I check out my second emitter, which is here, you can see that this one is up all the way up here while this one is down here. So I might go to the graph editor and just tweak its Y a little bit. So I'm going to just select this keyframe here, and if you need to add keyframes you just select the add keyframe tool, hold down the middle mouse button and drag an extra keyframe to where you need it to go. Okay, in this case I've got one here, so I'm just going to move it, so W, same way you would do, and I'm just going to move it so it's just a tad faster, so it's just keeping up with the other one. Okay, so they're in a very similar position now. In fact, so they're moving about the same speed as each other. You know, again, this is an experimentation. You can play around, add as many of these emitters as you want in order to sculpt your fluid or help sculpt your fluid. And I also, before we were just using speed of this emitter, now I actually want to add some heat and fire too. So I'm going to flick to frame 1, I'm going to add 0.1 of heat and 0.4 of fuel, and by frame say 12, excuse me, By frame 12, there's some idiot with a big horn outside my window, I apologise. By frame 12 I want to just key these again, and then by frame 15 I want to have the heat die off altogether, and by frame 25 I want to have the fuel die off altogether. Okay, so that's just changed us slightly, but what that should do for us is to get a more rolling fireball effect as the fluid goes up, because now we've got two of these emitters pumping some extra heat and fuel into the simulation. So another thing I noticed is we're quite dark here on our incandescence, so I'm going to change the incandescent bias on the fluid container. So if we come up to here, you can see right now that that's way too many. This is quite sensitive. Let's put this at 0.9. So we'll get a fireball for longer. This is only 1 second into the animation, so I want that good 1 second flash of fire right at the start. Another thing I wanted to change is I want to set the density under contents detail. So here we go, the density. The dissipation is 0.1. I want to change that to 0.8. This will just have the fluid dissipate slightly slower. This is useful because we're going to probably render this out around 100 frames, and it was sort of dissipating around frame 60, 65. I'd like to bring that up to sort of 85, and just tweaking this dissipation a bit should do that for us. So let me just take a quick play blast, and then we'll chat about putting some volume access fields in here to sculpt us even more. So I need to, of course, re-enable the evaluation on my fluid container. There we go. And I'll do a quick play blast now, and I'll see you in a second. Okay, so my play blast is finished. I just did sort of the first 45 frames, but what we wanted to see was our fireball to continue to roll at the top of our animation, and that's pretty much what we got, is our first bang, and you can see we're getting this nice fireball that continues to roll there at the top. So after all the other fire has sort of died down, we're getting this sort of secondary blast at the top, which is what I was looking for, the heat to rise up. This emitter here, number 4, is a tad slow still, so we can go back in and tweak that with the graph editor, just move its animation keys so it comes up a bit faster along with the other one. And again, this is a process of experimentation. It really does depend on the sort of effect that you're looking for. So again, I'm just popping open the graph editor, and let's take a look at this and its keys. I'm just going to make sure the evaluation on this is disabled, and then I'm going to find out where these two sort of come up together and part ways. Okay, so I'm looking for these to be in about a similar position at around this stage. So I can grab my emitter here and just push it up a little bit. So let's just try tweaking these keys so up it comes. There's other ways to do this, obviously. But I just like to tweak it in the graph editor. It's quite a fast way to do it, and I can actually see that it's going to go slow and speed up. It's going to give me some variation in speed here. Now that should get me a slightly larger rolling fireball at the top, which is what I'm looking for, because I've got this one here which I quite like. I'd just like to add a little more punch to it, so that should help me with that. And let me re-enable the evaluation on this fluid container. And before I do another play blast, I also want to talk about the fact that when our fireball comes up, I want the top to be more defined, so I'm going to put a volume access in to suck some fluid back into the center. So just with this selected, go to fields and volume access. Okay, so that's just brought in fact what I'll do is just reset the settings so I'm working with the same as you should be. So fields, volume access, reset settings, and I'll call this main VA. There we go. Create. Right, now if I go down to its volume control attributes, you'll see it's set as a cube. I want a sphere, and I'm going to make it a little larger. So I'm going to make this one quite big. And I'm going to position it around here, and its job is going to be to suck some of the fluid back into the middle and keep our animation a bit tidier. So to do this, to get it to, instead of blowing fluid outwards, to get it to blow fluid inwards, I can go away from center. So if I go -1, that'll shoot the arrows inwards and I'll be sucking fluid in, but I want to get quite a high number, so I'm going to go for about -12. I'm also going to go for a magnitude of around, let's say 50 or 60, something like that to start out with. So 60, and I'm going to animate it to go upwards as the explosion goes upwards. So it's going to pretty much stop on frame 25. So I want to come up here and key its translates, and then of course I'll have to key the translates for frame 1 as well, which I forgot. And also I don't want it to have an effect pretty much after frame 40, so I'm going to go in and just set some keys after frame 40 as well. So let's just key its magnitude at frame 30 at 60, and then let's key its magnitude at frame 45 at 1. Yeah, this will just help define more shape in our explosion. And it's just another way of shaping a fluid, as opposed to using an emitter to push it around. I'm now using volume access to push it around. And when we do our secondary explosion, I'll be covering these volume access fields in a bit more detail. Okay, so our play blast finished, and this is what we have. Which I like the secondary fireballs that come up the stack of smoke now, and the dissipation is good. It's about what we're looking for at this stage in the animation. So what I'm going to do is start working on the ground explosion now, because we only have here half an explosion. What we also need is all the dust that would be kicked up by something like this as well. So we're going to come back and we'll probably re-examine some of the settings on this later on in the tutorial, because this is an extremely low resolution fire at the moment, a low resolution explosion. So we're going to have to kick the resolution on this fluid container up to around 100. We'll probably end up with, and as I've said before, changing the resolution will also change how the fluid behaves slightly. So I don't want to do any more tweaking. I'm quite happy with what we've got so far. When we come back and change the base resolution later on, we may have to do some more tweaking, but for right now I want to just set up the scene so I can start working in the next part on the secondary explosion effects. So one of the things I would like to do is just grab everything we use for this explosion and group it together. So just Control G, and I'll call this main explosion. I'll also put that on a display layer. So you just want to create a layer and assign selected objects. This way I can just quickly and simply turn it on and off. So this just gets me a little bit more organized for my secondary explosion work, which I'll be doing all in the same scene. So I hope you come back for the next part when we'll start on the secondary explosion. So thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back. Now there's a couple of things that I want to do to prepare my scene before we start with the ground blast, and the first one is I want to create a proxy object for our main explosion. So all I've done is simmed out some frames from the previous lesson, really nothing more complicated than that, and what I'm going to do is let this get to a stage where I feel it's sort of big enough, and then I'm going to stop it and I'm going to convert it to a mesh. The reason I'm going to do this is quite simple. If we do a secondary blast, we don't want to be simulating both of them together all the time. We're going to need, however, a visual cue to get the size of our secondary blast about right. So, for instance, there's no point in having a secondary blast that's this big when our primary one is huge. So, you know, this will act as a good visual representation to us of how big the primary explosion is. Now, to get a really simple proxy object out, I'm going to have to export it, because as soon as I convert this to a proxy object, in this case a polygonal object, it's going to destroy my fluid container. So I'm going to make sure I've saved my scene as is before I do this, which I have, but you should pay some attention if you're going to do this yourselves. And I'm going to go down to Surface and just click Surface Render. This is then going to give me this polygonal shape. Now the resolution is a bit high for me, so I might set it to maybe bigger than that 1, and also it's losing some detail, so I'm going to set the surface threshold to say 8, and that gives me some detail back, maybe a little more, 0.6 even. Okay, so as proxy objects go, this one is fine. You can play around with the surface tolerance to get it a bit better, but honestly, it's simply not needed. It's just a visual cue for us. So let's go ahead and convert this to a polygon. So just modify, convert fluids to polygons. And you're going to want to go ahead and delete the history on this as well. So delete by type, history. And then finally we're going to want to export the selection. So I've got one already, explosion proxy. Just export that. Now I also want to export my fluid container. So I'm going to have to reopen the scene, and that would be lesson 5. Okay, so just reopen my scene. I'm going to export this fluid container also. So file, export selection, and let's call this main fluid container. Okay, the reason I've exported this is because now if I hide this, so under our layer, make it not visible, and now I'm just going to import my proxy object, so my explosion proxy, and also my second fluid container, which I saved as main. And apologies folks, I'm just going to have to open the file again, import the proxy object that we created, and re-import the fluid container. Now the reason I export the fluid container and re-import it is because we made quite a few changes to our main explosion container. And I'm just going to put this on a layer and make it invisible. So we made quite a few changes to our main fluid container, and by importing this one in, I kind of preserve those changes. So what I can do now with this container, and we'll call this one ground blast to stop ourselves getting confused, I can now use this as my ground blast container. So I can come in here and get rid of these emitters. I don't want this either. I'm not going to need the wind, and I'm not going to need the main emitter, but I now have this container all nice and ready with the same shading that we used for the other one and the same settings that we've used. This saves me a lot of duplicate work. And if I were to just go in and say open a sphere up and select fluid container, and now fluid effects, emit from object, so there we go. I've now got the same settings on this fluid container as I had on this one. It's just a really easy way of not having to redo all the shading and everything else. Okay, we're still going to need to tweak it, just gives us a bit of a base to start from. Okay, so now we've got our ground blast fluid container and our main explosion fluid container. We've got our proxy object, just purely as a visual reference, and I'll just rename this layer to proxy. We now need to start emitting fluid into this container, and I think I'll just whoops, there we go, and I'll call this one main explosion, just keep us a bit organized. So we've now got our ground blast fluid container with similar settings to our main explosion container, and we need some way of emitting fluid into it. Now previously I have done this with a just a standard volumetric emitter. I've done it with some geometry, so this time around I want to do it with some N particles. So let's just create some geometry to emit our N particles from. In this case I'm going to use a torus, and I'm just going to scale the torus up to about this size and make it a bit thinner, and then make it so it's not bisecting the floor too much. Okay, it's a bit wide, so I'll set this down to 0.06 and give it a bit more geometry to play with. That's a bit much. Okay, so this is the object I'm going to use to emit N particles from, and then I'm going to use those N particles to emit fluid. So let's start by just keying its scale, and then I'm going to move to say frame 25, 26, somewhere like that, and just scale it outwards. And once again I'm going to hit I must have hit S on the keyboard because I seem to have scaled everything. So let's just key selected there and move to frame 25 and come up here. Just get it slightly bigger than the container. We can tweak this later, and key selected. So over 25 frames I should be seeing this nice expansion. Okay, and I'm going to disable the output on this fluid container simply because we're not using it at the moment. So just disable the evaluation there. Okay, so you just should see this come out. Boom. Nice and simple. Now we need it to emit N particles. So we're going to go to N particle, create N particle, emit from object. Okay, I don't want an omnidirectional emitter, I want a surface emitter. Explosion debris is what I called it when I made this for testing purposes, so that will be fine. And I'm just going to leave everything at default and hit create, and you'll now see some N particles coming off it. In fact, if I select those, you can see that they're all dropping downwards. So the first thing we need to do is get rid of the gravity. Now I can go into the nucleus solver and turn the gravity off, or I can go under the N particle themselves, under dynamic properties, ignore solver gravity. So now I've got these N particles sort of floating around. What I actually want is for them to follow this torus along. So lifespan, they're not going to live forever, they're just going to live for 0.1. Okay, and we obviously need some more of them, and we'll make them bigger so they're easier to see. And under the emitter we'll emit sort of 60,000 of them. The reason they're sort of donutting up like this is because they're colliding with each other, which we really don't want. It's going to slow everything down and it's unnecessary. So under the N particle shape, let's go to collisions, turn off self collide, and there we go. now we've got sort of a nice particle spread output. Okay, so we're actually going to be emitting the fluid from these particles. Now, if you want to get rid of the color, I'm going to hide these, so this really doesn't matter, but if you did want to shade them and leave them in there, you can flip down to the shading tab. Blobby surface software that you see there is fine, that will render in mental ray. We can make them sort of opaque towards the end of their lifespan, so I'll change the input max to coincide with the age, and then I can just sort of make this one say a dark grey and this one maybe a black. Okay, I'll leave you to play with that. Just you can get these shaded a little bit more like smoke, but for us it's not necessary because we're going to hide them. I just really can't stand that hideous blue and purple colour, so there we go. Right, so now we've got our N particles. We need to stop them here because we really don't want smoke coming off after frame 25. So if we just jump to frame 24 and under the emitter, which you'll find under the torus shape, if we just key this at 60,000 at frame 24, jump to frame 25 and key it off. Okay, so there we go. It should stop at frame 25, which it of course does. So this time around, as I said, we emit the fluid from the N particle. I really just wanted to show you there was other ways of doing this. So now we need to connect it, of course, with this fluid container. So select your fluid container, which should now be in ground blast, and control select your N particle. Go to fluid effects, additive contents, emit from object. And I'm just going to make sure that that is reset. So apply and close. And actually it didn't get it. So that's because I've selected the emitter. What you actually need to select is the particle. My apologies. And then the fluid container, and now apply and close. So I'm not seeing that actually connected because we have the fluid container itself on disabled evaluation. So let's take a look at it now. Okay, and I can see that we are definitely having a reaction here. So we've successfully connected our N particles to our container. The problem is we don't want smoke and fire in this container, so I'm just going to set the temperature and the fuel to off. Because we're using this simply to sort of get the look of smoke blasted across the ground, we don't need anything but density and velocity. Let's play that again, and there we go. So this will form the basis for our ground explosion, and now of course we can come in, turn our proxy object on, and see that this is quite small. So, you know, again, the reason for having this proxy object, and let's get it to the last frame it will be on. There we go. So that's actually quite small. So what we're going to need to do at this point is look at some ways to blast this smoke out further, and you know, look at a way of really getting this to sort of billow out a lot more. So when we come back in the next part, we'll be taking this standard container that we just made here, and we'll be really tweaking up our ground blast with some volume axis fields and stuff like that to get it to actually blast out a lot more as well. So I hope you've found this part informative, and I will save now and see you in the next part. Thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back. At the end of the last part we left off here with our sort of ground explosion preparing to go. So it's just got a simple particle emitter that's emitting a fluid into a container. Now I took the liberty of skipping ahead somewhat. I'm going to show you all the process I went through, but I skipped ahead somewhat to grab you a play blast, and this is what our explosion will look like in low res after we finish this part. So you can see this ground blast here coming slightly towards the camera, and there's our main explosion. So I just thought that might help you envision what we're going to actually achieve with this thing on the floor. Now, while I was doing the testing, one other thing I noticed is I'd made this ring a little bit thin, so I'm just going to make it a little fatter and key it again. So I'm going to key select it, and I'm going to jump to 25 and just make that a bit fatter, sort of there. Key selected. It was just giving me a uneven distribution of particles that I didn't like, so I just make it a bit fatter to get a more even distribution. Okay, but this leaves us now with just this expanding ring of particles. It's not that great, you know, so now we need something to push this out like so, and to do this I'm going to use a combination of volume axis fields along with some wind air fields in the simulation as well. But first things first, I want to tinker with the shading of this bottom cloud a little bit, so let's just select its fluid container, and when I go up here I'm just going to make sure once again I've got temperature and fuel as off. This is all pretty fine. This came in obviously when we re-imported the fluid container from the original explosion. I might increase the max resolution a tad to say 400, just for later when we sim out at higher res. And contents details. Buoyancy at 10 is no good, so I'm going to break this connection, and I'm just going to set the buoyancy to -20, because what we're looking at, and a dissipation of a lot less, so -0.3. What we're looking at here is for the fluid to really sort of hug the floor. Okay, now with that lower buoyancy we've got a much more floor hugging fluid. There is one other, if I let this sim out a bit, and I'm just going to break the connection with this density pressure as well. So there is one other thing we can do to get this to stay a bit closer to the floor, and that's cheat. If we go to the shading, and I'm just going to up the transparency a bit so we can see a bit more what we're doing. This is fine on density, and for the drop-off shape I'm going to use a Y gradient, and as we crank this up you can see fluids start to disappear along the Y axis. So I'll put this around 0.85 maybe. We can tweak that later, and that's just another way of knocking any fluid off if it comes too close to the top of the container. Now I can also make my fluid a little more dense by kicking the input bias of the density here. And we can adjust this after we've got some volume fields in. So for a start that's kind of okay. I might go a little lighter in colour here. Okay, so let's just play that out now, have a look. Yep, that's kind of fine. I want to just check on my emitter here, fluid 2, to see if we have any speed. We do not, so I'm going to add a replace speed, and I'm going to add an inherit velocity of 500. I'm going to add a directional speed of 50, and I'm just going to make that in -1 in Y, sort of force it down towards the floor. Okay, so that's kind of doing what I want it now. There seems to be enough smoke in there. Oops, excuse me, that's a bit. Okay, that should be perfect. So this has created my sort of outward billow of smoke. Now I really want to force it outwards. So the way I'm going to achieve this is just click the fluid container, go to fields and use some volume axis fields. I will reset their settings. The volume shape I want is sphere, so I'm just going to create, and I'm going to scale this up to a reasonable size. There we go. And I want this to be directional, and at the moment if you look at the arrows it's not. So we'll go into the attribute editor and we'll look at the volume speed attributes. Now away from center I want to be 0, and along axis I want to be 1, and then we'll just simply rotate this, and I'll just make sure that's actually 90. There we go. So now I've got a direction, as you can see from the arrow. Let me just move this outwards to say about here. And the magnitude is a bit too low because we want a good push, so let's crank that up to about 2000. And I have obviously gone through this part already. That's how I was able to show you the play blast. So I tried various different magnitudes for various different results. I'll show you this one because from my testing this one would be too high, just so you know what something is too high is going to look like. And you can see this has given us way too much of a push out to the side. This is more like a cannon blast than a... So, but I did want to show you, because now when I stopped you can see that volume axis does give quite a nice push there. So let's dial that back to say 250. And again, if you are creating a different type of look, I mean, maybe you want this sort of cannon blast effect, so play around with these settings. They're not always, you know, this 250 is not always going to do what you want for every situation. It's just what I've found was quite reasonable for this. So I'm going to select this volume axis because there's not a lot to set up for the volume axis. Let me just check everything over before I duplicate it. Okay, so that's looking about fine. I just wanted to have one final check, because what I'm simply going to do is Control D and duplicate this, and then I'm going to sort of spread them out in a circular pattern around, just to help push my explosion outwards a little bit. Now you don't have to be too precise with this, and you can of course do some play blasts, come back in, give them a bit of a tweak. So I'm just going to continue to duplicate. And again, no need for extreme precision here. And you can use as many as you want. I'm probably going to use 5 or 6, but you know, if you want to make them smaller, get the explosion blast more pronounced in one particular area, feel free. This is all about sculpting the fluid in the pattern that we want it. So you know, sometimes you need more control than others. For me, this should be about fine. Okay, and that will do us for a test. If we bring back our proxy object, okay, we can see where the front and back of our explosion are likely to be, so I probably have a camera view somewhere around here. So let's have a look at what this is doing for us now. And I have just noticed something. As I said before, if you select your fluid container, you can see only one of these volume axes is purple, because this happened to us before when we went to duplicate. They haven't duplicated the connections to the fluid container. So just Window relationship editors, dynamic relationships. Let's select our ground blast container, and if we look under emitters, you can see that we're missing. Actually, we don't want emitters, of course, we want fields. You can see that we're missing our other volume axis fields. So let's just give a quick play blast, or just a quick test and see that they're all working. Okay, that's kind of spreading smoke around nicely. This is just to get us, you know, a general scattering. I am going to use a wind field, because what I would like is a little bit of smoke to go everywhere, but a lot of smoke to blow in the direction of the camera, because that's the angle and direction I really want to concentrate on, of course. As you can see, this is coming out now, and it's being sort of blown about. And it's hugging the floor pretty well, which is what we wanted as it comes out. Now just want to check my emitter here, our main emitter. So we've got a good amount of inherent velocity and directional speed. Our little chaps look perfect, and if you want you can select a couple of them, start to add some turbulence in, just to churn the fluid up a bit more. You don't have to do it with all of them, but you can indeed get, you know, some nice sort of randomizing effects this way. But what I want to discuss now is getting this to sort of come straight towards the camera. So we want a little bit of fluid blasted around in a circle, but we want a great big swath of fluid to come straight at the camera. And actually these ones here could do with really being pushed back a little bit. And this will allow them to force fluid out of the container earlier on in the animation. Let me just select this one here, which for some reason does not want to. Okay, there we go. And now when I play blast, we should get more of those initial big plumes, which we do. Okay, that's about perfect. As I say, feel free to play around with the turbulence, the placement of these, the size of these things will all create vastly different effects, but this is the one I'm looking for right now. And now I want to put a wind field in this container. So same as we did before, just go to fields, air, and this one I'm going to bound to a volume, so a cube shape, because I don't want to, say, blow air over a certain height. So I want to limit the force of this to about this height. Just move it up slightly. Okay, that should just about do it, and let's scale it right out. So this will now act as a wind field on anything inside this volume, nothing outside. So if a bit of smoke wisps up, it'll just continue to wisp up. It won't be blasted along, obscuring the main explosion. Here's the few settings I'd like to set on this wind field, or air field if you like. And we're going to look for its speed. So first of all, its magnitude. It's going to have a magnitude of, say, 2000, much higher than we used on the volume axes. In fact, let's make that 2200. Attenuation of 0. A direction of 1 in X, because we want it to come straight at us. Minus sort of 0.8 or 9 in Y, because we want it to go down. We don't want it to be forced up. And I just can't seem to get that right today. There we go, minus 0.08 and minus 0.05, or somewhere around there. We can play with that a little later. And the speed and inherent velocity are just fine because the magnitude is so high. So let's now just give this a whirl. Okay, and that seems to be spreading it across the ground in a much more even distribution towards the sort of camera. And if I let this get to frame 30, which is where our proxy object is from, we'll be able to see how large it is in comparison to our proxy object. We'll then know if we need greater magnitude on our air, if we need, you know, larger volume axis fields to blow the smoke further. Let's just give that a second. Okay, I made one change since I did this. I showed our proxy object, of course, but I also rotated my airfield 90 in Y because my explosive direction is kind of this way. I want people to be looking at the explosion from sort of here, and my airfield was blowing in this way, so I just rotated it 90 in Y. So it now blows straight forward. And if we hide our proxy object, we can see that we're actually getting a fairly good amount of smoke that's going to be coming up around our fire. What I would like to do is simply give these ones a little more speed. So if I select the correct one, there we go. I want to give this one a bit more speed because when I put my proxy object in, it could do with being a little further out by frame 37. So I'm just going to give it a belt more magnitude. So let's have a look where we find the magnitude. Up, 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 up. I'm going to make this one 350, and I'll probably do the same for this one. Again, sorry, having trouble selecting those correct ones. There we go. I'll probably make this one 300, and I'm going to have this one face the camera just a little bit more. And I seem to have tilted the entire fluid container. So let's make sure I'm just on the volume axis. There we go. And just to face the camera that little bit more. And that is the basic layout that we're using for our ground blast. So, you know, we might make some minor tweaks to the shading of the container. If I grab a few frames, we can obviously play around with the input density to make sure that we get enough or as little smoke as we actually need. And what I think I'll also do is just move this wind field forward slightly so its order of influence is more towards the front. This will allow these to be able to grab some smoke and push it out the side as well. So let's just move that a tiny bit over here, and that's again the fluid container. So let's just move this a tiny bit sort of over this way, and that should help some more smoke come out of here, here, here and here. There we go, we get a little bit more smoke coming out the sides now. Okay, let me just stop that. Just want to get a frame where we can see some smoke so we can start to maybe dial in the shading a slight notch. And maybe move this back a tad. There we go. And then you can take the fluid container and start shading away. So let's grab our ground blast fluid container, and if we knock this up we'll see more smoke, so we'll just have to find a medium that we're happy with on the right amount of density for this smoke. Sorry, on the right amount of opacity. It's obviously too little. And you can then tweak your Y gradient, of course, to, let's just pull this out, your Y gradient edge drop off to flatten the smoke nearer to the ground should you wish to. I think that's about fine. So this is looking pretty good to me. I'll probably set a render cam on my explosion from about here. Let me see my proxy object. And let's just have a look at that proxy object. Okay, so this is what I want to see. People get the full main explosion and they'll see this massive amount of ground dust sort of billow towards the camera. So just to put that into a final play blast for you, here's the one I sort of did while I was experimenting, and now I'll play blast the one we've just done, and you'll see they're fairly similar. So I'll be back in a second when this finishes. Okay, so I've done our play blast and here it is. So as you can see, I've got my primary explosion there, my secondary ground dust sort of kick up explosion, and I'll probably retime it a little. What I might do is, excuse me, this window whites out for some reason when I move this. What I might do is give this a bit of extra density actually from the emitter. I might also, so I'll go into the emitter we use for it here, which would be under the N particle system, excuse me, and I'll add 1.5 in density voxels per second. That'll just give me a bit thicker sort of extra smoke to work with coming out the emitter, which will hopefully blast a bit extra in this direction. I'll also probably go onto the fluid container, and now I've seen an actual play blast of it. I mean, sometimes you just need to see a play blast. I shall probably pick up this Y gradient a bit, let it come a bit higher off the floor, just a tad, and also come down here and give it a bit more density, not quite that much. Okay, and then I'll probably reorient my camera to its best position, but you know, you can always change the position of the volume axes, add more volume axes, change the direction of the wind. There's many ways to do this. I just wanted to capture a shot from sort of over here. There is also the point that this is going to dissipate around frame 75-80, which is fine for me because I want it to be pretty blown out up here by frame 100. If you didn't want that effect, you can always go back into the main explosion at that point and start tweaking the main fluid, either the input bias, or you can start to use the main fluid emitter, which will be under this sphere here, to add a little bit more density voxels per second in. I believe at the moment, if we check under the graph editor, that would be density emission at 15. So you can always put that up to 20, then it will take this longer to dissipate. You'll get a slightly larger explosion. So please play around and get something you're happy with. I'm quite happy with this, but you know, depending on the look you're going for. I should have showed you a few ways now of how to sculpt the fluid upwards and along the floor, and in the next part when we come back we'll start to look at how to separate these elements out into their own layers, because if you get an explosion, then obviously you want to composite into a background. You'll have maybe a house explosion or some other stuff, so you're going to need to hand this off to a compositor with the ability to say, look, you can change the color of the smoke, you can change the intensity of the fireball, you can change the color of the fireball, you can, you know, do all of this within a post-production environment. So I will see you in the next part. Thank you for watching, and we'll start with splitting this bad boy up. Alright, cheers. Hi, welcome back. Since the last part I've made some minor changes. I've added this background plate in here just by stretching my floor plane upwards. I've also gone ahead and cached out my explosion so I can now jump around the timeline. It's pretty slow on this machine at the moment, but that's generally because I'm recording as well as doing this, so I'll give this just a second to update. Okay, there we go. So I've just cached out both the main explosion and the ground explosion. I've also, you probably see it's a little more detailed, I've also gone ahead and set the resolution up to 70 in this case. So I'll just pop that open. And if you give a second for the attribute editor to update, you see I've got a base resolution of 70. I've got this for both fluids. Now I'd normally go up to around 100 for something like this, so you might want to crank yours a little higher. I'm just currently working on a machine that doesn't have much RAM. I think there's about 6 gig on this machine, and to go up to 100 at this sort of size of explosion you're going to really need 8 or 12. So depending on the amount of RAM you have, the higher or lower you might want to crank this base resolution. Now, so we don't have this massive machine slowdown that I've got here, I'm just going to go ahead and make these invisible. Okay, and you know, I still have my proxy object here. If I want to get a slightly different camera view, I can now use that to go ahead and do that. And you can see I've just put this big giant ground plate in, and that's about all I've done. So again, just flick the base resolution up on both fluid containers, both the same. I've then selected fluid container and just gone to fluids and cache, create new cache. This is something you're always going to want to do with dynamics before you batch render. So what I want to talk about now anyway is getting this to the state where we split it into heat, smoke, a sort of subsurface scattering layer, a shadow layer. So really give us the ability to break that all down in post. So let's get started. Now I'm going to rewind this back to the beginning and just turn on, we're going to deal with the main explosion first, so I'll just turn that on. Can turn this off, and what I'd like to do is copy the main explosion to its own layer, and this time it will be a render layer, not a display layer. So I'm going to select everything from the main explosion, and I'm also going to shift select this ground sheet, this ground plane, and let's see, this airfield I believe is not from the main explosion, these are all from the secondary explosion. Okay, so in our case it is actually quite organized, so it's just the main explosion and the ground plane. Now I'm going to create a new layer with everything on, and I'm going to call this explosion heat. Okay, and I'm just going to duplicate this again, so I'm going to add the same things to the next one, and I'm going to call this explosion smoke. And once again, explosion SSS. We'll get a sort of subsurface scattering effect with this one that'll allow us to make kind of fine adjustments in post. So right now we have heat, smoke and scattering. What we need is also a shadow pass, so let's just add everything in here again and call this one explosion shadow. So it should be pretty self-explanatory. We just want the contribution from the heat in the heat layer, just the smoke in the smoke layer. We're going to create this scattering layer, and then we just want the shadows in the shadow layer. So let's get started with the heat. And for this I'm going to need to delve into the fluid container. So make sure you're on your heat layer. And what we need to do to get the heat out by itself is actually quite easy. I'm just going to override the selected color here. So set layer override, and I'm going to make this black. So now if I have a look at somewhere where there would be heat and smoke, and this will take a while to update on this machine, there we go. You'll see that my smoke here is just black, so I'm just really getting the contribution from this heat. So let's just take a quick render of that, and I'll pause for this. Okay, so there's our render, and as you can see, our smoke here is just jet black. This allows me in post to isolate just this heat, so I could change the color of it, add a glow to it, you know, do various things which I will be showing you later on. Let's just take a snapshot of that. So now we've got a layer that isolates our heat. Let's move on to the next one, and this is not, you know, exactly that difficult to do, but let's take a layer that now isolates our smoke. So I shall just click up, and you can see the change between the smoke and the heat layer. Takes it a second to update, but you'll see all this brownish stuff go jet black. So there we go. So let's take a look at our smoke. So on our smoke we don't want any heat at all, so let's again dive into the fluid container. So I can leave the selected color the same. I'm going to remove all of this incandescence. I'm going to set layer overrides for. And I'm just going to turn them all black. and you'll see this is going to have to update my viewport, so it's going to take it a few minutes. I mean, I could just go and turn this off, but I think it's quite nice to see the update as it sort of happens. Okay, so I just filled that out, so you can see now all of where my heat would be is gone black. We also want to come down and maybe remove some of the lighting. In particular, you want a little ambient brightness, so let's just set a layer override for that and remove the ambient brightness. Okay, so that's the ambient brightness gone, and I'm just going to come up here and maybe whack this back to 0. In fact, let me undo that so I can put a layer override on before I put it back to 0. And just a second, folks, it's just taking my machine a while here. So let's create a layer override and just throw this back to 0. So there's our smoke in now. I'll just take a render of that and then pause. So let's make sure we've saved this one, and I'll just show you what our smoke looks like now. Okay, obviously our smoke isolation render here has come out extremely dark, and I've had a look through, and the cause of the problem seems to have been our light brightness under the fluid lighting tab should have pretty much always been set to 2. So obviously I have overlooked that during some part of this, but you can see now that we're starting to get this nice more smoky effect. So that will isolate our smoke layer. Let me just pause this while I do you guys a render so you can see the difference between that one and the jet black. Okay, now we can see the edges of our smoke. Remember, we're isolating smoke, so all of this should be a big orange fireball. The only bits we're interested in are these smoky bits on the outside. So at the moment we've managed to isolate the heat, so now we isolate the smoke. Okay, when we put all this together it'll make a lot more sense, although it's a pretty simple thing, so I guess you guys have got it. Now we're going to do a scattering layer, so we'll just go into our layers here and select our scattering layer. And because this is taking so long, I'm just going to come in and turn off the display for now. So you won't be able to see it update in the viewport, but I think you'll be able to figure out what's going on now. So I'm just going to take these again incandescences and make them all black. And I really didn't want to do that. Let's put those back where they were, and of course I need those to be layer overrides. If you don't set a layer override, it will just change it for every layer that doesn't have a layer override set, which is not what I want. So all black. Okay, so make sure they're all black, and then we want to just change the selected color as well. So let's grab this one and give this a hue of, say, some orangey color. Oh, nice orangey color. Let's see, around there will do. We'll get a saturation of 1 and a B of, say, 0.7, 0.8 maybe. There we go, nice enough orangey color. Just make that 35, and just for neatness. Okay, so that should be about it for scatter. We're not going to want any... Oh, and I've done it again. You'll have to excuse me, I'm having a slow day. I needed to set layer override for this, of course. So there we go, set layer override. And now we can just repick that orange we made before. Okay, so down at the lighting section, and we want no self-shadowing on this because we want it to act sort of as a subsurface scattering layer. No light brightness, so once again create layer override 0, and let's pump in some more ambient brightness. So let's create layer override and put this to 0.4. Okay, so if I turn back on my display layer for the main explosion, you'll see what this has done for us. Okay, so it's just given me this, and once again I'll take a quick render. And there we go, this render was pretty fast because it's got no sort of lighting effects on it. So from 1 minute for the heat to 41 seconds for the shadow, over to 14 seconds for the subsurface scattering layer. And this I'll use in post much the same way I would any scattering layer. It just helps me to give more options to tweak my fluid. Right, and the last pass I want to create for the main explosion is a shadow pass. So you'll notice that there's no real lights in this scene. Now in order to create shadows I'm going to need some real lights. So if I go into the layer editor and select render layers, in fact I think I'll turn this off for now. There we go. And I'm going to pop onto my shadow layer. I'm going to have to create a light, and I'll just create a directional light. I'll scale it to make it easier to work with. And it's just there we go. And I want to sort of get a backlit kind of shot. So first of all I'm going to make sure that this ground plane is receiving shadows. So let's see, attribute editor, render stats. I want the ground plane to receive shadows, but I want it to cast no shadows. So layer override, cast shadows no, create layer override, receive shadows yes. I don't need this ground plane to have motion blur or be visible in reflections or refractions. So I'm just going to turn that off for this as well. Now for the shadow pass I don't really want the fluid visible, I simply want to see the shadow on the ground. So I'm also going to come up here, make my fluid container visible again, which takes a sec to put the display back on the screen. There we go. I'm going to select the fluid container. I am going to go to its render stats. Which will be here, and I'm going to make sure that this fluid container's primary visibility is off for the shadow layer. So create layer override, don't need the primary visibility. Okay, these can be off, don't need it. I need it to cast shadows, and it doesn't necessarily need to receive shadows, but it won't hurt. So right now if I do a render of our shadow layer, you should see just the shadow on the ground. One other thing I might need to do is tell it to use real lights. This way it won't use Maya's inbuilt directional light. Okay, so let's just check that that directional light is actually on this layer. Okay, it seems to be. So let's do a quick render and see if we get those shadows. And we do. There's our shadow. Now we have other problems here. We don't want the background to be visible. We actually want a use background shader. on here because we want to isolate all of these. We also want to isolate the shadows, so I'm going to show you a quick trick to quickly isolate the shadows and the rest of it. We're going to select our plane here on our shadow layer, and we're going to assign a new material, and we're going to use a Maya use background shader. Okay, this will come in like so, and I'll just go back to the layer editor and make my display here invisible. In fact, I think I'll just go to shaded bounded box mode. There we go. Okay, so now I can take my ground plane, look at the material attributes on this, use background shader. Okay, specular color black, reflectivity, we don't want any, reflection limit none, shadow mask, matte opacity, this is all fine. So if I render out now, I should have a shadow in my alpha channel, but I've got a feeling I'm not, and I'll explain why in a sec. So if I look at my alpha channel, no shadow, just this weird dot. And we know that the shadows work because we've seen them work. So on a use background, they should appear in the alpha channel. The reason they don't is quite simply because the fluids and shadows don't really play nicely together on transparencies. If you have simple shadows, you need segmented shadows. So if we do this again, so if you're ever having a problem getting a fluid to cast the shadow, it's probably because you're not using segmented shadows. Okay, and there is my shadow nicely isolated in my alpha channel. This technique will also work for all of our other layers. So if I go to my subsurface scattering layer, for instance, and apply the use background onto its floor plane as well, and take a render, if you give it a second, you should see here that I have my SSS, and the reason it's coming in white is because I've got the display on alpha, display alpha, but that's perfect. So we've got a nice alpha channel for it, and you know, there's the color version. So now it's completely isolated. So I'll just go down and do the same for smoke. So assign use background, and the same for heat, assign use background. So if I was to render this heat now, it should also come in completely isolated. As you can see, there's our heat isolated, and if we click the alpha for it, it is indeed an isolated heat source. So we managed to isolate the main explosion's heat, smoke. We've done a scattering layer for it, and we've isolated its shadows. We of course now need a background, and at the moment we're using this simple polygon plane. But if you were actually blowing something up, like let's say a house, and you needed to render that out, I'm going to show you how. So we're going to create what I'd call a background layer. So for this, because the only thing I really have is my plane here, I'm just going to take my plane, throw it in its own layer. Okay, so it's just the layer here is just the plane. So I'm just checking these. Okay, and for this I'll turn on the display. Sorry, I'll go back to smooth shaded. Okay, so now this is my background layer. In here could be anything. This could be my matte, my exploding debris. It could just be, you know, whatever you want to put in there. I'm just going to do a simple background, so I'll just call mine background. And I'm just going to add a couple of crisscross directional lights just to give this some light. And so let's just move these up, and I'll just resize them so we can see which direction they're pointing in, and I'll flip one this way towards the background there, and one towards the foreground. I'm not going to spend too long on it. I'll just probably make this back one a bit dimmer. So say a light intensity of 0.6, and now I'll try and just render out my background plate to see what that looks like. Okay, that's not looking exactly how I want it. So let's see here. And this should be about fine. Okay, that's a bit more how I want it. I might have a play with my backing plate, but just I wanted to show you how we were going to isolate the background from the rest of it. So that'll do, basically. Simple as that. Depending on what background you're using, I'm just using this nice simple kind of easy plane. So that isolates out my main explosion. Now I want to isolate out my secondary explosion. So once again, I'm going to turn main explosion from visible, and I'm going to put the ground blast to visible now. And we'll also need to come back to the master layer for this. Okay, so with our ground blast, because we've actually got no heat, we don't need to make that a pass. We simply need a shadow, a scatter, and a smoke. So I'm going to rewind this to frame 1. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to select this ground blast and everything that goes with it. So this would be, let's see, this torus, this. And the background plane. Okay, so that should be it, and I know I'm going to need a smoke, a scatter, and a shadow, so let's just add this 3 times. 1, 2, 3, and I'll call this smoke. Let's prefix it ground smoke, ground SSS, and ground shadow. Okay, so ground smoke, it's going to be exactly the same procedure as we used last time. So grab the fluid container up to the attribute editor, and for smoke we want to override the ambient brightness. So let's create a layer override and set this to 0. This, if you'll remember, was incorrectly set at 0.1, should have been set at 2. Let's see, and we're also going to just want to set this incandescence to black, so let's in fact we shouldn't really need to set this incandescence to black, thinking about it, because we have no heat, no fuel, then the incandescence should never get used, but I'll just set it to black just on the off chance. Nothing quite like a 12-hour render later to find out you've made a slight error. Okay, so that should be our smoke. Let's just sim it through a few frames. Actually, it's cached, so it should be pretty quick. Okay, and there comes our smoke. So that looks absolutely fine to me. I'm going to call that one smoke. We also need to set this to use background. Okay, and let's get it in the right camera mode. And let's do a render and see if we've successfully isolated that smoke. Okay, Okay, there is our ground smoke, and there you go, successfully isolated. So perfect, exactly what I was looking for. So we're going to move on now, and I'm just going to set the shading to bounded box again. Okay, and now I just want to do the let's do the scatter. Okay, so again it's the same procedure, and basically we want the incandescence. Come on, wrong one. Incandescent set to black. Again, not strictly necessary, but as I've done it once, it doesn't take but a second. I'll do it again. Okay, and now the most important one for the scatter is just the layer override, and I want to get this the same one that I used before, so whoops. And again, let's create layer override. And I've somehow punched that out of bounded box mode, excuse me. So let's take this and make it 35. 1, and I think we used 0.8. Okay, there we go. So that should be it. A few tweaks in the lighting, because we of course want no self shadow and no light brightness, and a bit more ambient brightness. So let's just come here. In fact, I think we use 0.4. So let's flick us out of bounded box mode and take a render and have a quick look at our SSS layer, after we of course remember to assign the use background to this. So that's what we'll be using for SSS for our ground smoke. Let's just make sure it came in isolated. It did. Okay, so that's perfect, and we have just one more layer to do, which is this ground shadow, which is a real simple one. So we'll just come up again, we'll select the floor first, we'll make sure that it's receiving shadows. It should be. So let's attribute editor, render stats. Let's have a look. So it casts shadows, no, because we're going to put a light in here. We don't want it to, you know, get a shadow from this big backdrop. Receive shadows, yes. Visible in reflections and refractions I don't really need, so I'm going to turn those off. Motion blur I don't really need, I'm going to turn it off. And primary visibility is going to stay on because we want to be able to see it. So yeah, that all looks good. Now I want to go in and make sure that the fluid container has its primary visibility turned off, because remember, we don't want to see the fluid container, we don't want to see the fluid in the shadow pass, we simply want the shadow. So the cast shadows, yes. Primary visibility off. Okay, so let's take our directional light 1 and add it onto this layer. So let's just do a add selected objects. Okay, and I'll get a better angle for a shadow. And let's take a render and make sure we're getting that shadow cast on the ground. Okay, I'm most definitely getting the shadow cast on the ground, that's good. Let's just have the use background shader in there. And let's check that I get a nice isolated shadow. I probably will, but it just takes a few seconds to check it out. And remember, the shadows are going to come through on your alpha channel when you're using the use background shader in the way we are. So there you go, I am perfect. Alright, so that's pretty much all our layers set up. You just need to get your camera angle done. And just a second. So we've got a ground shadow, a ground subsurface scatter, a ground smoke. We've got a background, which is just this background plate, which could just be anything. I'm just putting it in to show you this is how I get my background in this particular case. I've got a explosion shadow, an explosion SSS, an explosion smoke, an explosion heat, and a master layer, which is everything all together that I won't be rendering. Which is why this is ticked off. So all of these layers are going to render out separately. This master layer, I'm not going to use it. Now that's about all I'm going to isolate out of this. So there was just one other thing, which I believe won the ground shadow. I've forgotten one of the layer overrides. I think I've forgotten to tell it to use real lights, so let's just check that out. Yes, I have. So I'll just create a layer override and tick use real lights for the ground shadow. I'll then just give another quick render to make sure we're still working. Yeah, there's our shadow. Right, other things that I could do is I could hide our emitters, by which I mean the geometry we use to emit from. So let me go to the master layout and turn on our explosions. So I've got this one. This one is the polysphere that if I unhide we use to emit the main explosion from. So I've already hidden that one. I just want to come in and hide this, okay, because we don't need it and we really don't want to see it on an animation. So I've got no other real extraneous geometry lying about. Let's just hide this, which I believe was just a piece of junk geometry from a demonstration a while ago. Okay, and I just want to double check my layers to make sure that the heat has no lights in it, the smoke has no lights, the explosion SSS has no lights, the explosion shadow has a light, the ground shadow should have the same light, it does, the ground SSS has no light, the ground smoke has no light, the background has lights, but that's just, you know, as many as you want in this case. So really all that's left to do is to make sure that you're rendering every layer that you want and not rendering the ones that you don't. And I'm just going to go to setup here. Now you can crank the quality if you like. I'm going to leave mine, you know, around the default level. I'm going to change my file type to OpenEXR because I'm going to be compositing this together in Nuke. I'm going to use 32-bit output. So once again, I'm just going to go to quality. There we go, and frame buffer. Where are you? And turn this to RGBA float 4x 32-bit. You can use whatever output file format you want. EXR is the default for Nuke. It's the file format it prefers, so it's what I like to use. Everything else I'm going to pretty much leave as standard. I have decided to render out 80 frames on my animation, so I'm going to just whack this to file name number extension, frame padding of 4, start frame 1, end frame 80. Renderable camera, I'm using the perspective, so that's fine. Resolution, this will be fine for a quick test one out. And there we go. So now it just remains to go and hit render, batch render. So I'll be back in the next part when we composite all this together. I'll be using Nuke as I said, but you can do this in After Effects or pretty much any compositing program. I'll show you Nuke, but the principle remains exactly the same whichever way you do it. So I hope you found this part informative. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you in the next part. Hi, welcome back. In the last part we left off after rendering out our explosion. Now if all's gone according to plan, you should have all of those layers rendered out, the ones that we put under render layers. So you should have ground shadow, ground SSS, ground smoke, an explosion shadow, an explosion SSS, an explosion smoke, and a heat. I took the liberty of tweaking mine a little bit after the first render was done. Haven't really done anything we haven't discussed before. I've simply gone ahead and, if I get this on a smoke layer, just change the animation speed of these slightly. So I just went into the graph editor and tweaked them around so they were a little bit faster and stopped at a bit of a lower height. So really that will just affect the way our explosion went upwards, so nothing too complicated there. So now we've got all our layers, I want to talk about putting them back together and the reason we made them all separately. Now I'm going to do this in Nuke. You can do it in After Effects or in fact any compositing package. The principles remain entirely the same, but for me I'll be using Nuke today. So first of all I need to get all of the render layers that we did, the heat, the smoke and whatnot, into Nuke. So I'm just going to go up and add some read nodes. Now I've got my several versions of this that I did. I'm just going to use this one and I'm just going to read in these layers one at a time. So my background layer, and you can see I just simply rendered out 75 frames of this. Now this is my ground smoke, so let's put it over here. Ground shadow, and I'm just separating the shadows out so I know what's what. Normally I would double click here and rename all these nodes. Ground SSS. Let's actually do that so we know what's going on. There we go. And the main heat is actually the fire for the explosion. You can probably see it down here. There we go. And again I'll just continue to read them in. And this is the main shadow, so let's have that over there. I mean, this seems like it takes a fair bit of time. It is actually worth it to get all of the layers out. You'll see in a minute when I start putting it back together. Okay, so that should be our layers in. Now, what we need to do is connect them together, and if you're used to After Effects, you'll be used to working in layers, or indeed Photoshop, you work in layers. Nuke works slightly differently. We'll be working with something called the Merge node, which you can think of as sort of a layer in After Effects. So if you're new to Nuke, you just want to select here and press M, which will create one of these Merge nodes, and we'll move it down. And I'm going to repeat this process, so just click the image I want, or the image sequence I want, and hit M, and this will bring in my merge nodes. Okay, so just that one for each, and then I need to connect them together. They'll go in a chain, so just grab this B here and just simply drag and drop it on the merge node behind it. I can then have B1 spare here for my background. Okay, just neaten this up a little bit. Right, and then I need to view my output, so I'm going to connect this last node in the sequence. So this would be layer 1, 2, 3, 4. So just collect this last node in the sequence to the viewer. And there we go. I mean, you'll notice straight away that this is not looking good. One of the reasons is up here we have the gamma correction set to sRGB. I want it set to none. This is because I rendered this out as a 32-bit image. The other reason is that same with layers in Photoshop or After Effects, each layer has an operation. So in this case it's over, which means this layer will go over this one over this one, this one over this one, and this is not really what we want. We want to plus these together. Now the background is fine because this is going over the background, but we don't want the main smoke to go over the main heat. We want to add them together. So I'll just double click this merge to node and change my operation from over to plus, and the same with this, from over to plus, and there we go. Now we start to get that more fireball that you would like to see. This one is fine as over, simply because it should go over the top of this, and this one can be set to plus. Okay, you could also use screen in this instance, won't make a huge difference. One of the things you'll notice is our smoke here is very orange. And this is because this SSS layer we've got here, or this fake subsurface scattering layer we've got here, it's probably way too bright. So if I go to the mix node and the merge node, and just alter its mix until I get sort of a nice warm smoke that I'm happy with. And again, same for the ground SSS, and I'll connect these the other way round. Smoke first, ground after. And again, just change its merge node until I get the color I'm looking for. So somewhere around there. So that's the basic comp to put it back together. And you can now start to come in here and say, okay, this ground smoke is a little too shaded, so maybe a little less on its merge, so we get a darker smoke. We also, our last compositing component is these shadows, and a real simple way to get these in, and let me just rename these so I know which one is which. Real simple way to get this in is to select our background, because we want the shadows to fall on the background. And another reason for separating this out into all of these layers, if you're going to later composite this into a real scene, an explosion in the desert, or a building blowing up, you're going to really need some control over the colors and light direction and things like that of your smoke, which simply because if you were blowing this up in a desert, you would expect this to be a lot more yellow as the dirt from the floor was kicked up. And with the way we've done it, you can now come in and alter just this color. The same goes for the fact that this ground smoke is a little translucent, for instance. So if I wanted to, I can simply gamma correct or correct the alpha channel. So if I just select this and hit G for grade, then I set it to alpha only, I can come in and start to, oops, wrong one, with the gain to change the actual transparency of my smoke down here. So the level of control I get with this is quite large. In this case mine was looking okay for what I wanted it for, but you can then come in also, if you just wanted to change the color, add another grade node, leave it on RGB. If you want to say hit the gain, and we'll do for a color swatch. So there you go, I have sort of complete control over the various elements now. So rendering it out in all of these separate layers can save you a lot of time in Maya. And if you're wondering, by the way, if you select any node in Nuke and hit D on the keyboard, it will disable that node. It's just sometimes quicker than hitting delete, because you might want to come back and retweak it at some other point. Okay, so now we've got pretty much everything on except for the shadows. So let's just add 2 grade nodes. So select our background and hit G and G, which will add 2 grade nodes. Now because our shadows should have come in as alpha channels, I go up here and select alpha. Okay, so there are our shadow alphas. What we can do now is we can pull out the side part here on Nuke that says mask, and we can tell the grade node to use the alpha channel as its mask. So when I come back in and we've got something there that's not right. Let's find out what it is. Okay. Ah, I know what it is. Ah, our viewer, excuse me folks, I had one of those moments. The viewer is still set to alpha channel, of course. I need to flick it back to RGB. Apologies for that, and just drag these grade nodes back into place. And now I can use the mask to go to the shadows. So what you should see now is not a lot, because I need to go in and tweak the gain downwards, and you should see our shadow come in. There it is. So this allows me a good degree of control over my shadows, my shadow color, sort of shadow density if you like, but I can also now select these, hit tab on the keyboard, and Nuke will bring up the search box for nodes and just add a blur. Okay, if I change the size of this blur, you'll see I've gone to extremely soft shadows. A little too soft in that case, but now I can play around with this, and without having to render in Maya soft shadows, which as you probably know will take a bit of time. I now have these soft shadows sort of faked in post. If I do a big zoom here, you can see. So again, just a great degree of control on my image. The same goes for the fact that when you render this out and you decide you want to add some post-production glow, this becomes extremely easy now, because we have a separate channel just for the heat. So this is where I'd want the glow. So I can come up now and just press tab again and search for a glow node. There we go. Okay, and you can see that I now have glow, but just on the fire. It doesn't make the smoke glow. So you tweak this till you're sort of happy with the look. That's about enough for me. I might put a grade in here, so just G, and up the gain a bit. So all of this work that we've done to get these passes out all becomes worth it in the end, for the simple degree of control that we now have in our compositing app. Now you could then go on, add grade nodes to the smoke, really tweak this extremely heavily to get the effect that you're after. Now I'm going to let this play through, and I noticed when I was bringing this in that I left my geometry turned on. Here, this was the ring that we used to emit the ground blast from. I should have obviously turned that off before I rendered it, but hopefully you remembered. Okay, so I just let it cache out so you could see the explosion, and I'm going to re-render this so I don't have that piece of geometry there, but that won't take too long, just a few frames. So if you have also forgotten to turn this off, just go back into Maya, turn its visibility off, and re-render the first sort of 10-15 frames. But there you go. That is the very basic composite inside Nuke. I would suggest that you take some time here, adding some grade nodes and some color corrects and things of this nature to your smoke. Just play around and see what sort of effects you can get and how much control you have over the whole process now. For instance, you can make your smoke way more dramatic. Add a little motion blur, really sort of have an effect on every element of your scene. So I'm going to leave you there. There was one other thing that I did that I want to cover in the final lesson, which was simply this. Here's another Nuke composite of my explosion, but this time what I did was a 360 freeze frame. So I want to come back and in the next part explain how I put that together in Maya. I just think it's a nice thing to be able to do a full spin around something like a fluid explosion, and you can see that it's composited in exactly the same way as the other one. So the shadows are just connected to these grade nodes via the masks, and then all the layers are in background, heat, smoke, SSS, and then again sort of ground smoke and ground SSS, and the operation is the same: over for the background, plus plus, over plus. Okay, so I hope that's shown you how to put it back together in Nuke after we split it apart in Maya. And like I said, Nuke or After Effects, doesn't really matter what you go for. Either one will do the job perfectly well. Okay, so I'll be back in a moment to explain how we got our 360 spin in Maya. So thanks for watching, see you in a while. Hi, welcome back. I just wanted to record this last small part to show you how I did the 360 fluid freeze, and in fact this is just a clever way you can freeze any sort of Maya fluid to get multiple shots from different angles, do a 360-degree pan, you know, whatever you need to do. Now, in order for this particular trick to work, and I've just cleaned my outliner up a bit, but it's the same. We've got our two fluid containers, one for the ground blast and one for the main explosion. So I just rename mine a tad. But what you'll need to, in order to achieve this trick, is you'll need to have cached the fluid containers. So if you didn't do this before you rendered out the explosion, you want to just come down, fluids and cache, create new cache. Now, depending on your fluid resolution, this can take, you know, an hour or two, but without doing it, you will not be able to pull off this trick, because the way this works is we actually manipulate the fluid cache file itself. So what we need basically is to go into the hypershade, and we'll take a look at the basic structure of one of these fluid containers, and then we'll see how we can manipulate it. So as you can see, it's a fairly big network. You've got your fluid container in the middle, then these will go out to your volume axis fields, and these are keyframes and whatnot. So if we come in, we should see a time node connected to a cache node. Okay, so what I want to do is tell Maya that I don't want to use this time node, I want to use another one. So we'll see that the time node itself is connected to the fluid shape's current time, and it's also connected to the cache. These are the two things that we really care about. Now, it's easy to create a new time node. I just had this written down from the last time I did it. So the first thing we want to do is create new time node. So create node time. Okay, and that's given us the result of a time 2. We then want to come and find the name of our fluid container. So in this case we're doing the ground blast. I believe we were doing the ground blast. Let me just check. Yep. Okay, and I want to copy that name because I want to connect the container itself to the new time node. So I'm just going to copy the name of the container. I'm going to go up to my document here, and I know mine is called time 2, out time, and my fluid container is called fluid container, fluid shape 1 to current time. Now if I try and connect these together, it won't actually work. I'll show you the error we get. So it just says that it already has a connection. So what we need to do is go in and find the connection from the fluid shape current time to out time 1, which is here, I believe. Yep. So just select this and delete it. Okay, now if we reapply this mel command, you'll see that our time should now be graphed to our fluid container. Let's have a look. So if we look back down here now, I have a time 1 and a time 2. So I've now connected time 2 to the fluid container and disconnected time 1. I now simply need to connect this time 2 to our ground here. So this out time is going to the time of this. So I just simply delete this, grab this one, middle mouse drag, and the reason this is taking some time is because the fluid is so large that my viewport is having trouble updating, and you can see how slowly we're going. So what I'm going to do is just flip that view from shaded mode to bounded box for the moment. Okay, and that'll stop the slowdown I'm getting. So middle mouse drag, drop it on, select other, and you want to go out time to time. Where have we gone? Okay, close. So if we go back and look at our fluid, and I want to get the shading back to smooth, and I just want to hide my main explosion here, so Control H, just so the viewport updates a little faster. If I now change the frame, you'll see that the ground blast frame change shouldn't move. Okay, and if we take a look at time 2 in the hypershade, okay, we should now be able to manipulate its out time. So if I set this to 22, and just give it a minute, folks. My computer is not running extremely well at the moment. Okay, you'll see what's happened now is my fluid seems to have disappeared, but you can see the fluid container is the same size. So there was a couple of other things that I needed to do. If you remember, we have our fluid set to invisible for sort of the first 6 frames. So I just need to go up to the graph editor. Okay, transparency RGB, and I believe we set this one to 0.4 for the ground blast. So let's just come in here and change these keys to 0.4. And once again, viewport update is taking a minute. Okay, we should now see our fluid. Okay, so there we go. Now our fluid is sort of frozen in time, so when we skip around the timeline, you'll see that it doesn't actually change. So this fluid has now become sort of frozen in time, which means I can now go in, manipulate what out frame it's on, which will obviously connect to this cache, and this time 1 is actually not really doing a lot at the moment. So you just repeat the same procedure with the main explosion, and this will give you a frozen fluid. Now if you want to set it, let's have a look here. I could set this to frame 20, and you can then set keyframes on this time node. Actually, I'm going to need time 2, not time 1. So again, if you've lost your time node, you can always just regraph the main fluid container or the fluid container, and that will show you where it is. So that's, there we go. So you can now set keys on this out time, you know, to get any frame you want. And the viewport is hellaciously slow to update once again, but hopefully you'll be using a slightly better machine than this. So you know, I've got this now. If I just set a quick key here, I'll set a quick key here, and now if I flip to frame 36, it will still be on frame 45. So this is a really simple way to just freeze a fluid on one frame. If you want to do the same turntable as I did, to set up the camera for this, and you can see I changed from frame 60 to frame 36 and my fluid indeed remains static. There's a really quick way to do a fast turntable in Maya. If you just make sure you're on the animation menu and then animate, and you can just hit turntable, give it a number of frames, hit go, and this will create a turntable for you. So that's how I froze the fluid. You just need to simply repeat the procedure for the main fluid container, and that should allow you to pretty much freeze any fluid you want and then get as many shots from different angles, or a 360 turntable or whatever you want to do. So that sort of concludes our tutorial. If you have any questions, you can get me on the forum. My email is david@SimplyMaya if you need to ask me some direct questions. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this one.